The morning heat was already rising off the red dirt parade ground as a new group of Army recruits stumbled through their first week of basic training. Most of them were farm boys, factory workers, and students who'd never held a rifle before. Their uniforms didn't fit, their boots were stiff, and the M1903 Springfields slung over their shoulders still smelled like factory oil. The Army called them green troops. Their instructors called them targets waiting to happen. At the far edge of the field stood a man the recruits hadn't met yet, Staff Sergeant William Bill Hanlon, 33 years old, a veteran of the pre-war regular Army. He wasn't a tall man, but he had a presence that cut through noise. His uniform looked worn but spotless, the chevrons on his sleeve faded from sun and years. He had served in the Philippines before the war, then trained riflemen for the National Guard. Now he'd been assigned to turn one underperforming rifle company into something useful before they shipped out to Europe. Hanlon's methods were already the subject of rumor across the base. Other instructors called him the drill sergeant who broke his own recruits. He didn't care. He had his own opinion of the problem. "The Army teaches them to pull a trigger," he told a lieutenant that morning. "I'm going to teach them to think before they do." The battalion commander had little patience for unorthodox ideas. Camp Swift was a place for standard procedure, known distances, paper targets, controlled conditions. But Hanlon argued that the war being fought overseas didn't work that way. In North Africa and Russia, men were dying because they'd never learned to fire under pressure, in mud, in wind, in fear. He read the reports. Rifle fire often went high or wide, even from trained marksmen. Soldiers froze under combat conditions because no one had taught them how to act like predators instead of panicked farm boys. So Hanlon decided to change that. On April 7th, he received permission to conduct his own intensive marksmanship program. The officers expected a few extra range sessions, but they got instead was something no one at Camp Swift had seen before, what recruits later called Hanlon's crazy drill. It began in the pre-dawn dark. Recruits were shaken awake at 4 a.m. and marched half asleep into the woods east of camp. They were told to bring their rifles, 2 clips of ammunition, and a single canteen. No targets, no scorecards. Hanlon met them at the tree line, a flashlight in one hand and a stopwatch in the other. "Out there," he said, pointing into the forest, "are 10 metal plates. You won't see them unless you learn how to look. You'll have 30 minutes. Find them, shoot them, and bring back proof you hit at least one." The men stared, confused. There were no markers, no safety lines, just thick brush, dim light, and the sound of insects. One private raised his hand. "Sergeant, how far are they?" Hanlon didn't look up from his stopwatch. "Doesn't matter. The enemy won't tell you either." Then he blew his whistle. The woods exploded into noise, boots on twigs, metal clanking, men shouting to each other. Within minutes the formation had scattered. Some got lost almost immediately. Others tripped, cursed, or fired blindly at shapes they thought were targets. Hanlon followed behind them quietly, notebook in hand, marking every mistake. When the half-hour ended, he called them back. Out of 42 men, only 7 had found and hit a target. The rest returned empty-handed, sweating and furious. One recruit accused him of setting them up to fail. Hanlon didn't argue. He just said, "The Germans won't give you second chances either," and dismissed them to breakfast. That first day set the tone. Every morning, the same drill. New terrain, new conditions. Sometimes he made them shoot from inside an abandoned barn through cracks in the wood. Other days they crawled through mud and fired at moving targets pulled by ropes between trees. He would order them to hold their fire until he shouted, forcing them to aim with shaking arms until the signal came. The regular instructors thought he'd lost his mind. The range officer complained that Hanlon's men were wasting ammunition and discipline. But something strange began to happen after the first week. The recruits stopped panicking when they missed. Their shots grew slower, more deliberate. They learned to use light, shadow, and cover. They began to hit the plates consistently, not at known distances, but from odd angles on instinct. Hanlon kept meticulous records. He timed their breathing, heart rate, and reaction under stress. His notes read like a field manual in the making. Hit probability increases 40% when shooter is trained to hold fire until pulse steadies. Stress control is the difference between aim and guesswork. By the end of April, the battalion's rifle qualification scores had risen by nearly 20%. When the results reached the training office, the colonel ordered an inspection. He expected to find chaos. Instead, he found discipline. Quiet, efficient, focused soldiers who moved and fired like they had been born with rifles. One officer watching the demonstration remarked, "They don't look like recruits anymore." Hanlon simply replied, "They aren't. They're hunters now." But the colonel still wasn't satisfied. "That's fine for training," he said, "but this army doesn't need hunters, it needs marksmen who can follow orders." Hanlon's answer was calm. "Then you'd better hope your marksmen don't face someone who can shoot back." He knew the real test wouldn't come on a Texas rifle range. It would come in the hedgerows of Normandy or the mountains of Italy, where visibility was measured in seconds and survival depended on whether a man could hit his target before the target hit him. And before long, that test would arrive, and it would prove that the so-called crazy drill was more than a stunt. It was the beginning of something the Army had never planned for but desperately needed, a method that would turn ordinary riflemen into deadly, patient snipers. Because while headquarters argued over procedure, Hanlon was already preparing his next phase, one that would push his recruits to the limit of what a human could endure and change the way the U.S. Army trained shooters for the rest of the war.
May 2, 1943, Camp Swift Rifle Range and surrounding scrub. Hanlon's next phase began quietly and without fanfare. He wasn't interested in ceremony. He was measuring weakness and turning it into habit. The colonel had given him limited latitude. Don't waste ammunition, don't interfere with unit discipline, and don't lose men. Hanlon accepted the constraints and turned them into rules for training that read more like survival instructions than range drills. First rule, teach men to see, not just targets on a paper card at known distance, but the subtle indicators that give away a concealed shooter, a disturbed leaf, a glint of metal, a shadow that shouldn't be there. Hanlon abandoned the bullseye. He put concealment first. Recruits spent hours learning to move without making a sound, to drop into a firing position without snapping a twig, to make a 30-yard stalk through brush in complete silence. He timed them, he filmed them, he made them repeat the same movement until the muscle memory was indistinguishable from instinct. Second rule, teach patience. Army marksmanship schools taught rapid acquisition, sight, squeeze, fire. Hanlon taught delay. He introduced what he called the heartbeat hold. Recruits learned to take a deep breath, exhale halfway, and squeeze during the natural pause. He set up exercises where the shooter had to hold for a full minute on a single aim point while Hanlon shouted distractions, shouts, simulated mortars, someone running a rope behind them to throw dust into the line of sight. The psychological effect was immediate. The men who could hold a steady aim through noise and motion were the ones who hit. Third rule, teach calculation. Range estimation in combat isn't a textbook problem. Hanlon trained his men to use simple tools, the width of a fist at arm's length, an outstretched thumb, the known size of a helmet, to estimate distance. He taught them wind calls with a pocket anemometer, but relied mostly on feel. Dust direction, ripple on grass, the way smoke curled in the air. He introduced handheld chronographs to log actual muzzle velocities from the old M1903s the unit used, and then mapped drop tables that the men memorized as if they were prayer. Fourth rule, teach pairing. A sniper alone is a marksman. A sniper with a spotter is a hunter and a tactician. Hanlon paired recruits 2 by 2, forcing them to share observation, to call wind and range, and to record results. The spotter's job was as important as the shooter's: estimate, correct, confirm. They learned to stagger movement so that one could cover while the other repositioned. Communication protocols were primitive: hand signals, a whistle sequence, and a shorthand language for elevation and wind. But under stress it worked faster than voice. Hanlon added a new challenge: the silent watch. 2 men would lie still for hours in the open, while others moved 5 yards away, making noise and creating distractions. The pair's test: observe and record every movement in a defined half-acre perimeter without revealing themselves. Most recruits failed the first time. Eyes wandered, curiosity betrayed them, a rustle of clothing gave them away. The ones who passed learned the hardest lesson: endurance matters as much as marksmanship. A good sniper could not only shoot well, he could wait, sometimes for days, for the right shot. Hanlon's approach required improvisation with equipment. There were no surplus sniper scopes issued to his unit. He modified service rifles with civilian-matched sights, fitted leather cheek pads to improve eye alignment, and taught his men crude but effective field marks for long shots. How to level a scope with a pebbled horizon, how to create a steady support with a rolled blanket when a bipod wasn't available. He instructed them on maintenance that wasn't in the manual, cleaning rings that held dust, hand lubricating bolt lugs to prevent freeze in cold weather, and lightly polishing barrels to keep accuracy in the field. The training evolved into a daily cycle: concealment drills at dawn, range estimation at mid-morning, long waits for the heartbeat at noon, and paired stalking in the evening. Weekends Hanlon used to test their nerve with live fire under stress. Blank charges detonated nearby, lights flashed, men yelling as if under attack, and the recruits still had to make their shot count. He rotated the exercises so every man learned every role: shooter, spotter, overwatch, and the unseen defender who tried to spot the hidden shooter. There were measurable results. By mid-May, Hanlon's spot teams could repeatedly place shots inside a 6-inch circle at 300 yards under simulated combat stress. He logged hit probabilities under different variables: heart rate, wind speed, concealment quality, and refined the drill until he could predict success rates within 10%. The training office began to notice. Records that had once shown average rifle scores now displayed an unusual spread: high marks for precision under pressure but varied performance in traditional timed requalification runs. Officers didn't know what to make of it. Resistance came from the top. The regimental training officer warned Hanlon that his recruits weren't standard, and standard counted in paperwork. They insisted on conventional afternoons on the range. Hanlon complied, but he quietly scheduled his own sessions at dawn and dusk when no one else was watching. He started keeping men back an extra week, unofficially, until they reached a standard he trusted. The battalion commander found out and demanded a briefing. Hanlon presented field data, kill probability tables, paired team efficiency charts, and the simple truth that in modern war, a single well-placed shot could save dozens of lives. The commander sighed, then authorized a pilot program: 2 squads attached to the infantry regiment, designated as precision observers. June 1, 1943, arrival of the first live test. You don't test snipers on a range, you test them in application. Hanlon got his chance during a battalion exercise that simulated a night raid on a defended farm complex. The setup was cold, realistic: machine gun nests, searchlights, tripwires. Hanlon's 2 squads, now nicknamed the Quiet Ones, were tasked with reconnaissance and interdiction. Their orders: move before dawn, observe enemy emplacements, and neutralize 2 priority targets without revealing the larger force. They moved at 0200 in drizzle, the pair separated, navigating with compass and thumbed maps. Hanlon watched from a ridge with night binoculars. Hour by hour, reports filtered back by hand signals. At 4:20, a whisper of movement, a single crack, and 2 enemy simulators dropped. 10 minutes later, another report: a machine gun crew gone silent.
The main assault force went in later that morning, surprised to find key enemy positions neutralized. Casualty figures in the after-action exercise report were low. The colonel called it a decisive advantage. Word spread. The adjutant called it an anomaly. The colonel called it effective. The regimental commander called for a demonstration under observers from the Corps. That's when Hanlon's men really proved themselves. June 10, 1943, Corps inspection detail at Camp Swift. A formal demonstration was staged. Observers from higher command, skeptical and busy, stood with cigarettes and clipboards. Hanlon's teams were given 3 hours' notice and ordered into a wooded area with artificial emplacements. The observers wanted to see discipline and measure impact. They didn't expect spectacle. Hanlon's men settled in, patient and invisible. The first shot came at 350 yards, a single crack followed by the subtle collapse of a metal plate. The next was at 600 yards through a gap in a barn wall. Eyes among the officers widened. A third shot, taken from the side of a shallow ditch, put a round through a small aperture at 750 yards, a distance the inspectors had called unreasonable for service rifles under stress. The last shot, a controlled double tap at 500 yards to simulate kill confirmation, completed the sequence. The inspection report used diplomatic language, notable performance improvement, recommendation for expanded field trials. But the men who watched told stories that left out the bureaucracy. They work like ghosts, one colonel said off the record. Another officer muttered, "If we had 50 of these teams, the next operation would look different." Hanlon simply told his men to keep practicing. He didn't want praise, he wanted reproducibility. Reproducibility required selection. Not every recruit could handle the discipline. Hanlon began an informal vetting process. He kept men who passed the silent watch, who could estimate range within 10%, and who preserved calm while their heart rate spiked. He reassigned the rest to standard infantry duties, competent soldiers, but not snipers. The core group shrank to about 18 men, steady and focused. Hanlon then instituted a rotation: 2 months of fieldcraft, 1 month of observation and ballistic calculation, and a final month of live pairing under limited ammunition. He also documented failure modes: recruits who flinched under sudden light, who chased every movement, or who could not remain still for prolonged periods were failure risks. Hanlon compensated with training, controlled exposure to surprise, breathing drills modeled after a boxer's relaxation exercises, and repetitious nerve conditioning. He taught them how to hide the human outline, how to break up a helmet silhouette with foliage, how to use mud to eliminate shine. By the time June ended, Hanlon's program wasn't anonymous. Word of the crazy drill reached other camps. Requests came in for instructors and demonstration teams. A report from a visiting major suggested copying Hanlon's method across selected battalions preparing for overseas deployment. It didn't happen immediately. Army bureaucracy moved slowly. But the men in Hanlon's unit were ready to move first. On June 28, orders arrived. The company would ship overseas in August. Some of Hanlon's teams were attached to the 1st Infantry Division for frontline service. Others were to serve as reconnaissance assets until a formal sniping program could be instituted. The official paperwork called them sharpshooter support, but on the ground the guys kept calling them snipers, not a pejorative, but recognition of a new capability. Hanlon packed his notebooks. He had charts, timing logs, and notes on every recruit's psychological profile. He also had a simple rule he wrote in the margin of one page: teach patience, teach observation, teach teamwork. Then trust them to kill only when it matters. He believed a soldier who learned to wait could change a campaign. 2 weeks before embarkation, he ran one last field exam, a simulated nighttime urban stalk through an abandoned farmhouse complex that resembled what they might find in southern England or the French countryside. It was hail and wind that night, a miserable test of concealment and nerve. The teams moved, and one by one they completed the mission. When they returned, muddy and silent, the recruits had a new look. Tired, yes, but precise. A quiet efficacy had replaced their earlier panic. Hanlon filed his reports. The battalion clerk stamped them and sent them up the chain. For the men, the real test would not be paperwork. It would be cold, wet, loud, and deadly, the actual front. But with Hanlon's drill, they left Texas not as green recruits, but as trained pairs who knew how to watch, wait, and make a single shot count. The transport ship left the harbor in August, and Hanlon watched the recruits board. He didn't promise them glory. He told them what he always had: you don't shoot to make noise, you shoot to change what happens next. They carried his silent drills in their heads like a private map: pulse control, spotting, camouflage, patient calculation. They were about to find out whether those skills would make them killers in the field, or whether the chaos of real combat would strip every lesson down to raw survival. The answer would come faster than anyone expected: in a hedgerow, a ruined village, and a quiet morning when a single shot decided who lived and who died. September 12, 1944, northern France. The 1st Infantry Division was advancing through the patchwork of hedgerows and villages left shattered by the summer fighting. German resistance had shifted from organized defense to a series of ambushes and delaying actions. Every tree line and farmhouse window was a potential firing point. Infantry units moved cautiously, and casualties from hidden shooters remained high. It was here, in the narrow lanes near Mons, that the results of Hanlon's crazy drill would first be tested under fire. By now, most of Hanlon's original trainees had been scattered across different companies. They weren't officially called snipers in the order of battle. They were designated observers, attached in pairs to rifle platoons.
Their weapons were standard M1903A4 rifles with simple 2.5x scopes. There were no ghillie suits or special rations. What separated them from everyone else was the mindset drilled into them over 6 relentless months at Camp Swift. See first, wait, act once. The 2nd Battalion of the 26th Infantry Regiment was tasked with clearing a village called Saint-Laurent-en-Aisne. It looked small on the map, but the place was a maze of stone walls, orchards, and barns, ideal terrain for hidden defenders. German forces had pulled back, but left behind small teams of experienced riflemen and machine gunners. Within the first hour, the lead platoon took casualties crossing an open field. The incoming fire came from somewhere ahead, 1 or 2 shooters, unseen. The platoon leader called for his attached observer team, Privates Finch and Morales, both products of Hanlon's program. They crawled forward through brush until they reached a small drainage ditch that gave partial cover. Finch raised his binoculars. Morales scanned through his scope. The first shot they fired wasn't at the enemy. It was into the ground, measuring dust drift and wind correction. The second shot dropped a German rifleman who had been firing from a hayloft 280 yards away. The kill was clean, unseen. The platoon moved again. That morning became the pattern for the next week. Whenever the advance slowed, Hanlon's trained pairs went forward. They mapped enemy arcs, neutralized isolated threats, and allowed the main body to keep momentum. Reports filed afterward by company commanders noted a consistent pattern. Enemy fire silenced by small arms, distance unknown. Hanlon himself arrived in France 2 weeks later as part of a replacement training group. He wasn't in command anymore, his role was advisory, but he tracked his former recruits through field reports and occasional letters. He read about the Saint Laurent action, the use of range estimation under fire, the confirmed kills at distances beyond 400 yards. One note from a lieutenant read simply, "Your men saved us crossing that orchard." By October, headquarters had noticed. An order from 1st Army Headquarters directed field commanders to identify and standardize the precision observation elements within infantry units. The order referenced the performance of the 1st Infantry Division and cited unusually effective use of concealed fire and controlled engagement. It didn't mention Hanlon by name, but those who knew the origins recognized his fingerprint. Hanlon began touring frontline units, inspecting equipment, and collecting data. He carried a battered notebook filled with sketches of firing positions, range tables, and notes in cramped handwriting. He spoke little. When asked what made his system different, he answered plainly, "We stop teaching them to shoot and start teaching them to see." In the field, the conditions were brutal. Mud soaked through every layer of clothing, rifles clogged with grime, and fog limited visibility to a few dozen yards. Under those circumstances, many soldiers reverted to instinctive firing, short bursts and panic shots. But the men who had come through Hanlon's drill didn't waste ammunition. They stayed still. They waited. And when they fired, the effect was immediate. A regimental after-action report from November described one engagement near Aachen. 2-man observation team positioned west of the road. Enemy counter-sniper activity suppressed. Estimated 12 enemy neutralized over 2 hours. Friendly casualties, 0. Enemy withdrawal followed. The 2-man observation team was another of Hanlon's pairs. They had spent the night crawling 600 yards through wet grass to set up before dawn. At first light, they had identified glints from enemy optics and taken the shots in sequence. No radio chatter, no movement, just calculation. By the end of 1944, word of their results reached back to the States. The Infantry Board requested full documentation of Hanlon's method. He was ordered to compile a training report, not a story, but a technical outline of drills, results, and performance charts. He worked in a tent outside Liège, surrounded by rifle parts and notebooks. His report, Field Adaptations in Precision Marksmanship Training, ran 46 pages and listed data on stress tolerance, reaction timing, and concealment effectiveness. It included diagrams of his early range setups at Camp Swift and noted measurable improvements in field accuracy under combat stress. But while paperwork circulated, the war continued. During the Ardennes fighting that December, Hanlon's former recruits were again thrown into chaos. Snow, fog, and German infiltration tactics turned the front into confusion. Standard formations broke down. It was during those weeks that Hanlon's crazy drill proved its ultimate value. One recorded incident near Buchenbach involved 2 of his men, Corporal Finch again, and now Sergeant Morales. Their company had been cut off, taking fire from an unseen German machine gun position across a frozen field. Visibility was almost 0.
Using nothing but the sound of muzzle reports and faint flashes through the fog, the two men triangulated the enemy position. They crawled forward in the snow, took up a position behind a fallen tree, and waited for a gap in the fog. The single shot they fired silenced the gun. One bullet through the gunner's chest at an estimated 310 yards. The company advanced. That report reached Corps headquarters the next day, labeled Probable Sniper Elimination. Hanlon read it later and underlined a single sentence, waited 27 minutes for clear line of sight. That was his entire philosophy condensed to one fact: patience as a weapon. As spring turned to spring, the Army formalized the lessons. A circular issued in March officially established sharpshooter observation teams as part of rifle company structure. Training procedures were drawn from Hanlon's field notes and the after-action reports of his men. The Army never used the word sharpshooter in the paperwork. It was considered too narrow, too specific, but the intent was obvious. By April, Hanlon's health was failing. Years of exposure, exhaustion, and field work had worn him down. He returned to the States before the war ended. His men stayed overseas until Germany's surrender. Many of them continued to serve in occupation units, where their skills, patience, observation, and calm under pressure, were used for reconnaissance and security operations. After the war, the official record listed his contributions simply as experimental marksmanship instruction. But inside the units that had seen combat, the story persisted. Veterans told of the crazy sergeant who made them crawl through the woods before dawn, who forced them to hold their fire until their pulse slowed, who said that a rifle was only as good as the nerve behind it. What had begun as a condemned experiment at Camp Swift ended up reshaping the Army's understanding of precision fire. Hanlon's drill produced men who didn't just shoot, they thought, they calculated, they waited. And in a war where seconds decided survival, that difference meant everything. It was a simple truth proven on battlefields across Europe. One sergeant's crazy drill had turned untrained recruits into patient, efficient killers, the kind of shooters who didn't just survive war, but changed how it was fought.
In the months that followed Germany's surrender, the U.S. Army began breaking down its wartime experiments, documenting what had worked and quietly discarding what hadn't. Among the stacks of reports sent to Washington was one thin file marked Hanlon, TM, Field Innovations in Marksmanship Training. It contained the 46-page summary he'd written outside Liège, along with field evaluations from 7 infantry regiments. None of it made headlines, but buried inside that file were data points that would shape decades of military training. The post-war assessments were blunt. Standard rifle marksmanship courses, the same ones taught since before 1939, showed a combat hit probability under stress of less than 15% beyond 200 yards. Units that had adopted Hanlon's field regimen showed rates approaching 45% in comparable conditions. In practical terms, that meant smaller ammunition expenditure, lower exposure times, and fewer casualties. Army analysts described the results as anomalous but repeatable. What they didn't realize was that Hanlon had replaced shooting drills with discipline drills, teaching men to slow down when every instinct screamed to fire faster. By 1946, the Army Ground Forces Board quietly incorporated portions of his method into the revised Rifle Field Manual, FM 23-5. The language was stripped of personality. Phrases like controlled target engagement and observer cooperation replaced his own blunt sayings, but the foundation was unmistakable. Cadets were now instructed to estimate range visually before using instruments, to observe for 30 seconds before firing in uncertain visibility, and to operate in paired elements whenever possible. Hanlon never saw those pages. After returning home to Texas, he left the service with the rank of staff sergeant and took work as a civilian instructor at a small rifle club outside Austin. He rarely spoke about the war. His students remembered him as patient, quiet, methodical. When asked why he insisted on long pauses between shots, he would answer, "Because real targets don't wait for you to think." In 1948, the newly formed infantry school at Fort Benning conducted a study on advanced rifle observation. The officers running it had read Hanlon's wartime notes and invited him to consult. He declined, citing poor health, but mailed them a copy of his range diagrams and an annotated version of his old notebook. The study's final report referenced an unorthodox but effective conditioning system derived from field experience 1943-45. It later became part of the framework for the U.S. Army Sniper School established 2 decades later. Meanwhile, veterans who had come through his crazy drill began to influence new generations. During the Korean War, several former Hanlon trainees were recalled to active duty as instructors. Their course outlines bore a familiar signature: silent observation, range sketching, two-man operation, single-shot engagement. In interviews years later, one of them, Sergeant Robert Morales, said, "He made us shooters, but more than that, he made us patient. That's what wins fights. Not noise, patience." Hanlon himself faded from records. He died in 1951, age 41, from respiratory complications. The Army issued no formal commendation. His wartime unit's histories mention him only in passing. A non-commissioned officer, attached to the training section at Camp Swift, but his methods lived on through the men who carried them overseas and passed them down quietly, class after class. By the 1960s, when the U.S. military began formal sniper programs in response to combat conditions in Southeast Asia, many of the principles traced directly back to what he had done with scrap targets and condemned recruits in Texas 20 years earlier. Instructors at Quantico and Fort Benning cited World War II field innovations emphasizing concealment, patience, and precision. The exact origin was uncredited, but the language, observe, calculate, engage once, was pure Hanlon. Today, fragments of his philosophy still exist in modern doctrine. The pairing system remains standard. Observation before engagement is codified procedure. Even the psychological conditioning, breathing control, trigger timing, delayed reaction under stress follow patterns first written in his field notes. Most soldiers who train under those rules never hear his name. They only learn the principle he repeated until it became reflex. See first. Wait longer. Shoot once. The irony is that what had begun as a punishment detail for a stubborn sergeant became a cornerstone of precision warfare. Hanlon's crazy drill, born from frustration and necessity, turned ordinary recruits into measured, deliberate shooters, capable of deciding battles from concealment. It didn't make heroes, it made survivors. In the end, his contribution wasn't about rifles or marksmanship charts, it was about control. The idea that a soldier's greatest weapon wasn't speed or aggression, but patience and discipline under chaos. That truth outlived the war, the manuals, and even the man himself. And though few remember his name, every time a trained sniper waits in silence, calculating distance before firing a single decisive round, they're following the same crazy drill one sergeant taught in a dusty field at Camp Swift, Texas in 1943.